Hey there, folks out there in Internet land, and here I am, Dr. John, the Mad Professor, and my associate and assistant, Shaggy. Shaggy, say hello to the audience. And he waved his tail for you. That's more than enough. And I got my popcorn ready because I'm just waiting on those toilet paper riots to start in Walmart in America. When those prices hit and shortages start hitting, people are going to go bonkers in America. Americans are not used to shortages. They are used to going into their supermarkets and their Walmarts and their Costco's, and they are used to seeing stuff all over the place. Hundreds of brands of toilet paper, hundreds of brands of cereal, thousands of different types of fruit and vegetables. America is a very privileged society. Now, I am an American, but I grew up in England, and in the 60s and 70s in England, there was a lot of economic issues. There were shortages. I remember there being shortages on bread, shortages on sugar, shortages on eggs. They would ration them at the stores. You would go in, you could only buy a certain amount, and you would go to the marketplaces, and you'd be able to buy in the black market sugar at maybe 3 4 times. Anyway, look, I'm not going to get into the details. Um, America is not nearly prepared for this, and you're going to see, in my opinion, you're going to see riots in the streets. You know, this is what I want to talk about today. I told you I have my popcorn, right? Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk about logistics. Yeah, I'm a sociologist. I'm not a logistics expert, right? But society, I am a sociologist, the study of society. Society is made up of people who are in an interaction process. Some of those interactions are cultural, we're sharing norms and values, we're enforcing rules. Some of them are social, there are family ties, there are community ties, there are peer groups. Some of those connections are political. You've got states, you've got governments, you've got different types of processes for making collective decisions. Some are authoritarian, some are maybe more democratic, and there are also economic ties. Now, what are the economic ties? This is the process by which society produces, distributes, and consumes goods, right? And one aspect of when you look at economics is how goods are distributed, right? In terms of who gets more, who gets less, not just in terms of class, but in terms of regions, countries, racial groups, genders, right? There are definite patterns, right? And this is one of the things that sociologists as well as economists look at. The other part of distribution is how goods are physically distributed, right? In other words, this is called logistics, right? It's from an old Roman term for movement, basically. So when you're, in the old Roman days, they were experts at logistics. When you're planning a military campaign, you had to plan the movement of all the elements of the army and, very crucially, of supplies, right? So we need to make sure there's adequate water for the troops, there's adequate support in terms of maintenance of equipment. We have to make sure there's adequate transport. There's whatever is going to be needed, right? Given the level of technology at the time, that's logistics. And on a social level, logistics and economics means shipments. It means processing plants. So when you take tomatoes, which may rot in a few weeks, right? You have to move them quickly, or they're gone, right? Like they never, you just wasted a year growing those crops, right? So part of that process is you can them or you freeze them, right? So these are part of the logistics process, right? And then there's shipping, right? So you have to ship, which means to move, right? Of course, we call ships, but shipping is not just about ships. It could be by airplane, by truck, by mule, if necessary, right? So that's what shipping means. It means the process of moving from one place to another. right? In this case, of various different types of products. So I'm going to try to break it down very simply, right? You go into the supermarket, and I'm sure you're like, "Oh, prices are going up." Blah, blah. Well, we have this phenomenon called inflation, right? Over time, what happened? See, inflation is not about the price of the goods, right? Because the price of the goods is a relationship between the people who are buying and selling the goods, right? We call that supply and demand in economics, right? If you have a lot of rice, right, and maybe you have more rice this year than we don't need that much rice. Well, the price of rice is going to go down. There's too much supply, right? So the rice producers are desperately trying to sell their rice, right? And then the consumers are like, well, look, I have enough rice. I don't need any more rice. So it's like, okay, but I'll take yours if you make it cheap, right? So it pushes the price down, right? Other times there's a shortage, right? In a time of shortage, maybe not so much rice is there. So people are like, dang, I need more rice. Where's the rice? So they're going out and they're saying, I need to buy some rice here. I'll pay you more, right? So you have market competition pushes up and down the price. Now that's not inflation. That's just variations in price, and products will change prices over the year because in different seasons you have different. For example, the price of oranges is going to be higher in the winter because there are not many oranges, at least not fresh oranges, right? So part of that is it's more expensive to produce, right? And in the summer, you have all these oranges coming into the market. They're a lot cheaper. The supply went up. The demand stays more or less the same. Maybe goes up a little bit because people are more used to drinking orange juice in the summer. Whatever, right? The point is, supply goes above demand. The price goes down. In winter, the supply is below demand, so price goes up, right? So these are natural fluctuations or variations. They have nothing to do with inflation. So when you track inflation, you have to go year by year. That's why, economists, you don't look at the monthly variations in prices, right? You have to go from year to year. What was the price last year versus this? And even that may be affected by things like, a drought or a disease in a certain plant or crop, or something else has happened that has kicked off the supply chain, production chain, or whatever else, so that for some reason there's less supply this year than there's last year, or maybe there's more supply this year, right? One arching. See, economists have to track these things. I'm saying, right? It isn't just about, it's more expensive today. Oh, eggs up. Blah, blah, blah. A lot of that has nothing to do with anybody. It's not inflation. It's just variations. Like the price of eggs went up because a lot of chickens were being killed because of bird flu, right? So there were less eggs. So people want their eggs. Okay. So that's how capitalism works, right? If there's the market balances out, right? If there's more supply, then people are like, well, the suppliers are desperate to sell, so they're going to lower the price. If there's more demand, the people are desperate to buy, so they're going to offer a higher price, right? You could call that a rationing system, right? Maybe it's not fair on some of the producers who now make a loss because they don't get as much money as they thought they were going to get. Maybe it's not fair for some of the consumers who can't afford to buy the luxury item, or they have to substitute a cheaper item, blah, 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 right? You get it, right? This is not about inflation. But the tendency for inflation are two things. One is money supply, right? So as the money supply increases, that is basically the government produces more money, or there's more credit available, people can borrow money, right? This means they have more money in their pocket so they can demand more, right? When they go out and they demand more, what happens is, of course, that's going to push the prices up in general, right? If you give, like, sometimes a kid will say, well, why don't we make everybody a millionaire? Well, if you give everybody $1 million, the prices will just shoot right up until it absorbs those $1 million, because you can't, it's not about the money, it's about the products, right? So overall, the amount of money you have is going to be divided into the amount of products you have. If you just put money into an economy, whether by putting more money out there or making better loan rates or lower you know what I mean, lower interest rates, and people can borrow more money, right? It's obviously much more complex than that, right? But very simply put, you put more money out there, prices are going to go up. That's not a problem necessarily, right? Except conceptually, because then people go to the store and they say, oh my God, the prices are going up. Ah, chaos, chaos. People like stability. They like to go to the store with a plan. Like, I'm going to get 6 eggs. It's going to cost me like $1. If they go to the store and they see that 6 eggs cost $10, they're like, oh my God, how am I going to make dinner? Right? Now, again, another thing about inflation, which is why in my mind I'm always like, why are people so obsessed about inflation? Is that typically when prices, if you have more money, that's because people have more money in their pocket. They have more money to spend. So that's a good thing, right? Or at least it balances out. So as long as that distribution of money is even, right? If I gave everybody $1 million, everybody's basically back to where they started, right? If you have a loaf of bread that costs $1 and you give everybody $1 million, now the loaf of bread costs $1 million, right? That's a vast simplification, but what you have in your pocket is going to match what you're able to buy, right? The products that are out there. So what is going to, that's not magical. That's just the way it's going to work, right? So what's going to happen then is that inflation itself is not a problem. In fact, it's very often seen as a good thing by economists to have a small amount of inflation because inflation helps to smooth things over, right? So, for example, you might have a case where some products are too expensive for the good of the economy as a whole, right? So, as inflation or the price goes up on those goods, it encourages other suppliers to come in and supply those goods, right? Or to become more efficient, right? Now, and it also, I mean, the other side of it also acts according to wages. So, for example, an inflationary cycle may tend to push down wages, which might, I tend to favor labor over capital, but in some cases, people are overpaid, right? You had people in the Midwest earning massive amounts of money making cars, basically semi-skilled labor, right? These people basically had the skills of a janitor, but they were making $50, $60 an hour in today's money because the car companies in the 50s and 60s had virtually a monopoly, right? U.S. car companies, right? Not a monopoly, but they had the vast majority of the marketplace around the world. So they were able to, like, we don't want to have problems. We just want to make money. So we're going to pay you whatever you want. So the labor unions became very powerful. The workers earned all this money. And this is why people today, they're like, well, back in the 60s, people could buy a house and it was like a year's salary to buy. Yeah, because they were being vastly overpaid, right? The other side of that is people in other countries, what we call the third world, were desperately poor because they were not getting these advantages and they were being essentially, if they wanted to buy a car, they had to pay through the nose for it because they're paying these fat cats $60 an hour auto workers, right? So, what happens over time? Well, as the U.S. car market became less competitive, right, because they were based on these massive salaries, you have another inflation happens, and this is what happened in the U.S. in the 70s. You had an inflationary cycle, and what did it end up doing? It ended up pushing down the cost of inputs, particularly labor, rents, other inputs that had become overstuffed by this period of the 50s and 60s, this period of virtual monopoly that the U.S. car market had. Right, so that may not sound good if you're like, oh, I'm a car worker, I earn $60 an hour. Yeah, but you didn't really earn that. You were getting that because the companies had a monopoly and they had to keep you happy, blah 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 down the chain. So eventually that's gonna even out as you start getting competition from Germany because they don't have those labor issues, right? So you'll see this tendency, right? Labor costs will shift. They'll become too high. When they become too high, they will, people will look for an alternative labor market, right? And you might say call that, oh, that's terrible. That's globalization. But the reality is, those people in those other countries are just as capable of doing the work, and they're going to charge a lot less because these disparities are not natural; they're artificial, right? So this takes us back to this whole debate about globalization, right? This concept of free trade, right? And obviously this is something pushed by American businesses primarily, the Republican Party primarily in the 70s and 80s, right? Ronald Reagan was one of the earliest virulent promoters of the concept of free trade under the concept of neoliberalism, right? And at that time, I was violently opposed, and I believe the way they did it, massively benefited the super wealthy in the U.S. Because basically, they could easily take their capital out of the U.S. and just plunk it wherever they want. Oh, I'm going to build a factory in China now, and we can hire a bunch of workers who will cost us maybe $2-3 a day, versus paying hundreds of dollars a day for a worker in the U.S., right? So they would save money. All right, you could call that greed, you can call that corporate response, you can call that whatever you want. But at the end of the day, it's an economic reality, right? The world, nature abhors a vacuum, right? You have a vacuum, you have a place here where people have too much money in the US, and another place there where people don't have any money. Well, where do you think the work's going to go? Right? It's going to be sucked out, as a famous American politician, Ross Perot, once said, without having any real understanding of what he was talking about. But that's all right. He talked about the sucking sound to the south because labor standards and wages were lower in Mexico, so work was, well, yeah, it was. But, again, you have to look at the bigger picture. It's like watching the sea. The water's going to go downhill. You have an area of the sea where the water is lower. Well, the water's going to flow into that area, right? The bigger problem is the class disparity, because the problem is when they did this process of globalization or free trade, they did it in a way which massively favored the wealthy. And this is in a couple ways. One was by massive tax cuts begun under Reagan, right? So he did the first, sheaf of massive tax cuts that almost entirely benefited the wealthiest people. George Bush Jr., George W. Bush, did another massive wave of tax cuts, and then, of course, did another massive wave of, and he's doubled down on that, right? So what this has done is it meant that the wealthy are paying a far lower percentage of tax in terms of their income and wealth than they have ever done, right? And of course, the Republicans justify by saying, well, wealthy people, they produce everything, they make everything, they're responsible for everything, right? Well, anyway, I'm not going to get into all that debate, except to say that, first of all, no, they don't, because they don't produce anything. They may organize stuff, they put stuff together. Secondly, our most productive period in the United States was during the 50s and 60s, and the income disparity was much, much lower, right? Wealth disparity was shrinking because the government was actively encouraging people to buy houses. They had low cost mortgage insurance. So, for example, before World War II, these numbers are kind of off the top of my head, but they're approximately correct. Only 1/3 of American households owned their own house. 2/3 rented. I may have this a little bit wrong, but the distinction is not wrong. After World War II, after the GI Bill, we'd gotten into the 60s, 2/3 of American households owned their own property. Only 1/3 went rented. So this meant a massive shift of wealth to the middle class. And this, again, is why people are like, well, back in the 50s and 60s, middle class households, they could afford a house, they could afford a car, yeah, because of these massive subsidies, primarily for the middle class, not for poorest people. It was for the middle class. And then at the same time, you had these very high, artificially high salaries. So a semi-skilled laborer, which means like a janitor, working in an automobile plant, could be earning, in today's money, $60, $80, $100 an hour. right? Because they had very strong unions, and also, frankly, they kept out minorities and women and all of that stuff. So there was this was part of the racism of the period, but I'll talk about that in another different episode. Anyway, so what's the point? So you had this period in the 50s and 60s of massive economic growth in the United States. Inflation was still low because the US could export its goods. So even though people had more money, the goods were being exported, money was being brought into the country, and it was being stabilized. People had had a massive amount of products available to them, right? Production went up, right? So that meant you had a very low periods of inflation. What happened in the 70s and 80s is as other countries start to compete, right, then U.S. products cannot be sold as easily abroad, if at all, right? And even, of course, in the U.S. market, people are buying for. So money's being sucked out of the economy. The government's printing money or making money more available for people. So you have go from the 50s, 60s where people are saving money, they're investing money in long-term investments, and that makes a big difference also. It's another technicality in terms of effective production, investment, and in prices. If you invest in long-term things like government projects, highways, schools, universities, right? These absorb money but produce long-term values, right? So 20, 30 years down the road, you're still getting a benefit out of that investment, right? So that balances out the inflationary spike. On the other hand, if you just go out, I got $1 million, I'm going to spend it all on a bunch of knickknacks, right? And everybody does the same thing. The price of knickknacks is going to go through the roof, right? And you see that sometimes with these pop, or now they call them meme commodities, right? That something becomes, wow, oh, we got to have that because it's become pop, and suddenly the price goes crazy, right? You see that with stocks sometimes, right? Why did Tesla go up to 500? It went literally from like 100 to 500 in a couple of years because, you know, Musk tied his uh, his chariot to Donald Trump. Why are other stocks going up and then suddenly they're going? Well, stocks are kind of an artificial commodity because they don't have any reality to them, right? They're based on the reputation or the perceived reputation of whatever's supposed to be behind it, which in some cases is nothing, right? So we see cases where, like, companies that have been around forever and have factories and have solid properties all over the place, and they're bought up by a company that basically has nothing behind it, like just a fantasy company, right? Like a lot of the dot-com period where people were buying dot-com stock because they thought it would go up forever. Now you've got Bitcoin, same thing, right? He's a fan. There's nothing behind this. It's all speculation. It's all just, well, other people are going to buy it, so I better buy it. Then the price will go up, and then at some point I'll sell it. But you know what? When everybody sells that stock, it'll go down to zero because there's nothing behind it, right? Whereas these traditional companies that had land and factories and were actually producing things, their value just stayed constant, right? And you had a situation where a dot-com or one of these fantasy stocks would come in and swoop and buy up something. Anyway, I'm not going to get into it any more than that, right? So what happens then when you, okay, my point is this, as usual, blah, 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 way too much, right? The reality is when you look at the real price of things over the last 40 years, they have been coming steadily down, right? People have more stuff. You go into the supermarket and compare, even though prices, you talk about wages, I'm talking on a global scale, right? The US, yes, it hasn't seen so much of a benefit, right? Because the US was so advantaged in the 50s and 60s. Since then, it's setting itself in a situation called relative deprivation, right? Relative deprivation is like, well, deprived is when you're really poor and you can't afford anything. right? Relative deprivation is when you feel poor because other people are becoming maybe not richer than you, but they're catching up to you, right? You're the Joneses, and then you see the neighbor next door. Oh, they got the same car I got. I'm not rich anymore. I'm just middle class. I'm just a regular guy. Or maybe the neighbor even has something better, right? Like you go, now the U.S. is like 50 years ago. Japan was like desperately poor, people dying in the streets of hunger. You go there now, they're better off than the U.S. Europe is better off than the U.S. in many ways, right? So Americans are like, they go to the Europe, and they're like, hold it, they have streets without potholes. They've got a working health insurance system. They've got this. We don't have shit, right? You go back to New York and get boom, 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 boom on all the potholes, bridges falling down just because the wind blows, right? So you say to yourself, hold it, we're not rich anymore. We're poor. Right? In your mind, now, the U.S. is still a rich country. It's an incredibly rich country. It's still overall the richest country in the world. Maybe not on a per capita basis, but certainly overall, its wealth is still vastly superior to any other country. Right? But the problem is this: people feel impoverished. Right? There's more resources, but the other side of that is also this growing internal inequality. Right? There's a large segment of homeless people. There's a huge amount of crime. All of these are results of this massive internal inequality. You got people, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, these people own, it just boggles the imagination, right? I mean, they own more than, between the top 10 families or whatever, they own more than the 90% of American population put together. So that's why, even though the U.S. is still fabulously wealthy, that wealth has been so concentrated by all these tax cuts and other benefits given to the wealthy, basically. Right? And then, the people feel worse off. On average, they are worse off, particularly than people maybe in countries like Europe, or places like Europe, Japan, Hong Kong. Right? So you've got this phenomenon going on. People in the U.S. have felt like they're getting poorer, they're being relatively disadvantaged, relatively impoverished compared to certain other countries in the world. And even poor countries, like Americans are used to going and feeling like we're better than you because we're rich, and hold it, they're not poor anymore. They're getting along just fine, right? So maybe we have the problem. So why have these prices been going down on a global level? Well, two things. One is technology, right? We have, like, again, people complain, well, I struggle to get by. I have a full-time job. I can't afford this. I can't afford. Well, look at what you have. You've got a computer, right? I'm looking into it right now. A phone that has more power than the rockets that went to the moon, right? More features than the entire U.S. government in 1965, right? We can talk to things that were fantasies. Oh well, look, detectives talking on phones to people, right? In the 20s, they thought this was just crazy sci-fi stuff. It's like this is reality for everybody. Even people in the jungle got cell phones now, right? And then we have all these things that in the 60s would have been considered fantastic luxury. Even having a refrigerator, right? Like standard now, everybody's got a refrigerator. It doesn't matter how poor you are. You got a refrigerator, you got a TV, and you got a cell phone, right? 60s, that was not true. Not everybody had a refrigerator. Most households did not have a television. They did not have certainly a cell phone. Most households didn't even have a phone, right? So the amount of production, wealth that has been produced over these 40, 50 years is massive. So you can't compare the prices. Oh, the price of apples, like in the 50s, it was 5 cents an apple and now it's $1. Well, you can't compare that because you're earning 20 times more than that guy was earning in the 60s, right? So that balances out. And yet you have cell phones, you have all these means of communication and other things, technologies at your hands, right? So that means in reality, life is a lot cheaper now, on average, on a global level, than it was in the 50s and 60s. The other side is logistics, right? Because as technology has improved, as shipping has improved, we can move stuff around. So you go into your supermarket, you can see rice, most vegetables, most fruits. These were not available in 50 years ago. They were not available in your supermarkets. Believe me, I grew up in the 50s and 60s. We did not see things like avocados. We did not see fancy apples. We did not see fancy looking vegetables, arugula, whatever it is, right? Because most of your produce had to come from local areas. You might go through a whole winter and never see a fruit, a ripe fruit, right? Everything would have to be canned. You couldn't have frozen because they didn't even have freezing capacity at that time, right? So let me go on and on, right? This is these logistical things. You go into the supermarket. The fact you can do that is because of logistics, right? It has made these things massively more available. You don't see a cheaper price because a lot of these things weren't even available, right? So now they are. They've been factored into our, and that's why sometimes we feel things are expensive. But in fact, we can go back to the basics and just say, okay, let's just eat bread, let's just eat rice, let's just eat the basic look, and you would be able to live so cheaply. Except a lot of these logistics are based on free trade, right? So you can ship from China, and now it's cheaper to ship from China sometimes than it is to ship from next door, right? Because there's these massive ships that have 40 container vessels on them. Each container vessel can have a million gadgets in it or whatever they have, right? So it may cost you a couple $100 to ship a car from China or wherever. Just China's a poor excuse, to the US. And it's not just the ship, it's all the technology that goes around it, the logistical technology, the communications, the planning, the ports, the trucking, the rail systems. Right? Now, these are all investments. When you buy a ship, you're expecting to make back your investment over 20 years. So I buy a ship for, let's say, $20 million. Every year, I'm only going to spend $1 million of those dollars. I'm going to get back whatever I get back in terms of profit. Right? See where I'm going with this? When you put a stick in that logistical supply chain, you create a hornet's nest of pure hurt because that supply chain has been perfected given these conditions over the last 40 and 50 years. Right? And Donald Trump has stuck a stick right in the supply chain of the world. Well, not of the whole world, only of the US part of the world. Right? The US is the part that's going to be really, really impacted by this. Right? The rest of the world is still operating under that glorious logistical system. It's just like the US is cut out like a box. It's boxed off. Trump has declared war not just on China. That if he had wanted to declare war on China, we would beat China. Right? But it's like they told Hitler, don't fight a war on two fronts. Conquer one enemy, then you conquer another enemy. No, Trump attacked everybody. He's like a flailing monkey on crack cocaine. Right? He attacked and he spiked that supply chain. So what's happening now? Even if when people said, "Oh, we don't know what the tariff's going to be. We don't know what the prices are going to be for goods coming into the U.S." So stop everything. Don't ship anything because we don't know if we're going to make money or not. It's a fundamental premise of capitalism that was put forward by a sociologist named Max Weber. He said, capitalism is the systematic process of rationally making money and more money. And the only way you do that rationally is you have to project and say, this is going to cost me $1 to make, and I can sell it for $1, so I make $1 profit, right? So now they don't know. They don't know what the cost of that good is going to be, because the government's going to randomly come down. And every economist and every political sociologist in history has always said the worst thing for a capitalist system is arbitrary government. Because when government comes in and arbitrarily just says, you know what, you got too much money, let me grab some of that, right? You know what, you're making too much of a profit, let me put a tax on you. So why bother, right? This is what life was like in the Middle Ages. Kings and whatnots, earls and dukes, and they would each come down and say, hey, this farmer's getting too rich for his, but let's just take some of his money. Oh, we'll do a special grab and snatch tax. That's why people were so poor during the Middle Ages. Right? The only times people got wealthy is when they had a rational form of government, like during the Roman Empire for certain periods, and other empires that created some tax stability, right? Tax stability is the key issue here. And now you've got the central, most wealthy government in the world is being run by a tax maniac, a guy who is randomly putting tax prices. What do businesses do? They cannot operate. They have stopped shipments. And this is the thing. It isn't just food and produce and immediate consumables. It is inputs. Every American product, everything produced in the US, right? It isn't, we don't produce everything anymore. We maybe never did, but certainly now it's very rare, because it's like, well, we can get the steel cheaper here, we can get this cheaper, or just for convenience, right? These people can deliver. Okay, we have a supply chain from Singapore now, or Bangladesh, right? It isn't all about exploitation and taking advantage of people. It's just because it's more convenient. And over time, at least according to economic theory, these things will balance out and they'll help produce a development, which is what they have done over the last 40 years, right? But this is this. So what happens? It isn't just consumable. It isn't just you going into the Walmart and suddenly they don't have avocados and they don't have mangoes and they don't have a lot of those nice little cute fruits and vegetables you've gotten used to, right? And they don't have the top quality meats that you're used to, right? Because now you have to source everything locally, right? It's that most of the things you produce are also sourced, have inputs from abroad, spare parts, bits and pieces, right? And now you can't produce a car, you can't produce a TV set, you can't produce a washing machine, you can't produce any gadgets because each gadget has a part from abroad. And it isn't even about the tariff. It's not the tax that is the problem. It is the uncertainty, the insanity from this regime in Washington D.C. Right? Donald Trump and his monkeys, Peter Navarro, the tariff monkey, and then this Steve Miller guy, the racist monkey, right? And then you got a bunch of other flunkies floating around, and then this guy who's supposed to be the economic genius of the Trump cabinet, at the Treasury, who just goes around and says, well, I don't know, whatever Trump says, it's got to work out because he's Trump and he's an expert in business. And the guy failed every class he ever took at Wharton or had somebody else write it for him. So this is the problem you're going to have in America, right? Until you get that guy out of the White House, or, well, really, you just have to take away that power. That is not a presidential power. The president is not authorized to raise taxes in America under the U.S. Constitution. The president does not have the power to raise taxes, but he is, and they're letting him get away with it. So all you have to do is take that away from him. Done. You have a law put through by Congress that cannot be changed without a legal, rational process. And that would solve every problem in the U.S. and on a global level, at least after 3 months of people starving in the streets. Well, that's far too much for me tonight. Look, you disagree with me? Write something in the comments, share it with your friends, tell them what a bozo I am, and as I eat cheese flavored popcorn, and you know, I'll be watching. Got my popcorn. I'm watching. And seriously, I do hope things go well for people in America. I am an American, um, but I've been very disappointed with the way the country's been run over the last 3 months, particularly. But again, it isn't just Trump, it's the system that must be changed. You must get rid of this excessive, arbitrary presidential power that doesn't even make there's no possible reason why we're giving emergency tax powers to the president, because these are things that can and should be worked out in Congress through the proper congressional process, right? But they're like, we don't want to get blamed for anything, so they just want to stay in office. They're a bunch of cowards, and I'm including the Democrats as well as the Republicans. They just want to stay in. That's why they gave the president these powers, so the president gets blamed, right? But now you got a president who's going to use those powers, and in the most nefarious way. So yeah, it isn't just the fact that Trump got elected. We've created this powder keg over the last 40, 50 years, giving the president all these massive powers, and we're paying the cost. As the saying goes, I forget who said it, but people get the government they deserve. The United States at this point deserves Donald Trump, right? Because we deserve to get the shit kicked out of us economically, and I hope it doesn't become military. That's another discussion. You guys have a great night, and like I said, help promote this web if you feel I have anything useful to add to the debate. Good night.